us back, bring our audience back to 50 years ago and the start of this wonderful industry that we love, which is the Nicaraguan cigar industry.
Of course. I want to start though with commenting something that's very important. And we're turning 50 years this year. And it's not about the number, it's not about the 5 and the 0 and being older or being younger than someone else. It's about what those 50 years represent. And in our case, it's not about the brand itself, it's not about the building or how old that box is. It's about the people who ultimately add up the experience of those 50 years. So our story, our history, I have to say, is tied hand in hand or intertwined with the history of Nicaragua and its people, meaning the opportunities, the hope, the struggles, the obstacles, the challenges that we as a country have faced. And it all began in the 1960s when the 1961 a experimental process began in which Nicaraguan tobacco first was planted in the fields. Some U.S. makers and some tobacco growers were looking for alternative places where to grow tobacco because now, by 1961, after the Cuban Revolution and the Cuban embargo was imposed, Cuban tobacco and Cuban cigars were no longer readily available, or at least legally, in the United States. So they found in Nicaragua, and particularly in the Esteli Valley, the perfect spot to get that tobacco leaf, that richness of flavor, that aroma, that body, that pleasure that gives us tobacco for cigar making. And it all began in the beginning of the 1960s, and we started growing as a country tobacco to be exported to the United States for cigar making. Excuse me. But then in 1968, a couple of Cuban immigrants, one called Juan Francisco Bermejo and Simón Camacho that we saw previously, they decided to start making cigars without tobacco. They found great opportunity and they started rolling cigars under the Joya de Nicaragua brand. So this is the first brand of premium cigars. Now, Nicaraguan tobacco is older than that, but premium cigars, which is the result of your experience, your talent, your art form of transforming that tobacco leaf into a cigar, enjoyable cigar, is what they dedicated themselves to. And they began in 1968, and they began in a small factory in the center of town. They eventually grew the brand and especially started selling it in the United States. The brand gained quick popularity in the United States because it was not only an alternative, but a better alternative to the cigars that were available in the market up to then in the United States. Remember, this is 1960s, so what we know about cigars today, that that profile, that complexity, that's completely different from 50 years ago.
Yeah.
So it was a bargain from them, but it became very quickly a success story. They started growing, they started producing more and more cigars, and eventually the brand itself became the official cigar of the White House.
What? What? Really?
Yes.
How did that happen?
It's a curious story. Actually, the sommelier of the White House back in the 1969 was playing at the tables in Vegas. And they approached him and he wanted a cigar, and they basically, the only cigar legally that he could find was this brand, Joya de Nicaragua. And he smoked it, he enjoyed it, and he brought it back to the White House and made it the official cigar of the White House. That meant that dignitaries, politicians, and foreign presidents could find that cigar in the White House when it was legal and it was allowed to smoke inside the White House. It was the cigar that was handed out to dignitaries when they went into the green room to have personal meetings and protocolary meetings with the presidents in the U.S., Nixon in particular. This happened until the Ford administration, when cigarettes were banned altogether in the White House. But before that, Joya de Nicaragua was enjoyed as the official cigar of the White House.
Oh, that's phenomenal. That's phenomenal. Now, something bad happened though in Nicaragua. We had the revolution. How did that mess up Joya de Nicaragua?
Well, the revolution is, it's a very important historical milestone for us. It's not necessarily bad. It's a historical moment in which Nicaragua was ruled before the revolution by a political dictator, the Somoza dictatorship. And the revolution basically overthrew this dictatorship in 1979. So the factory back then, the maker of Joya de Nicaragua, was was affected, not only physically, because during the Civil War it was bombarded. Actually, this building was bombarded and burned down. It's part of the. If you actually go out on the facade of the factory, you can still see the consequences of that fire. You can see in the upper part, and I'll show you later. It's darkened by that fire.
Joe, we gotta take pictures.
Definitely.
All right.
So that's the story of the building itself. But because of the revolution, a new political system was established in the country, a communist system, which basically nationalized all the private businesses, including Joya de Nicaragua. That meant that the factory and all of the production, tobacco processing, tobacco growing, was now under the control of the government. That meant that this factory was basically ruled by a government company, because that's how communism worked.
Yeah.
Because of communism, of course, the United States wasn't very happy about that, so they did two things. They first declared an undercover war against Nicaragua, the Iran-Contra affair. For those who know a little bit of your history, might remember, was basically the CIA training contra-revolutionaries to fight against the new communist regime. And the second thing was that the U.S. declared an economic embargo, as they had done with Cuba a few decades before. They declared against Nicaragua. That meant that Nicaragua could no longer export any products, including cigars, to the United States. And that was the factory's biggest market back then, of course.
I bet that hurt you. That hurt you.
It did. Of course, now having a stockpile of cigars with the biggest market in the world being closed off, that meant that the factory had to look for alternative places where to sell the cigars. And they started selling the cigars in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union, Germany, Poland. That's one of the reasons why Joya de Nicaragua has such a strong international reach too, because it was selling cigars very early back then, due to historical circumstances, but selling cigars nonetheless.
And Spain is your strongest country, correct?
Spain, Switzerland, and Germany are our strongest.
That's right. The Swiss. That's right. Props. Java Rev over there. Us Swiss people.
So this is how we started selling the cigars, or the company started selling the cigars to Europe, and they would get paid back not in cash, but in food, with oil, and with weapons to finance the civil war that had resulted from that conflict between the Contras and the Sandinistas. And all of that happened all during the 1980s. The 1980s is a very dark decade for Nicaragua, not only because of the war itself, because of hundreds and thousands of lives that were lost as a result of the civil war. Interestingly, most of the fighting during the war occurred in the northern part of Nicaragua, especially in the Jalapa Valley, in Estelí, where tobacco is grown. So imagine, tobacco is difficult to grow in normal circumstances.
Yeah.
Now imagine growing tobacco during a war. Until 1994, the Jalapa Valley was a minefield. Basically, you could not do anything, but they still kept growing tobacco. Leonel, who by the way is our general manager, who's been with us for a little bit more than 30 years, he was the head of the whole tobacco growing operation for the state in Jalapa and in Estelí. So he knows the stories very well, the war and trying to work under difficult circumstances.
Man, that's crazy. Now, hey, Juan said, this is like recent. This is during our lifestyle. I mean, most of us are 30, 40, 50 years old. This isn't like, 100 years ago, like the World Wars or the Revolutionary War. This is stuff that we lived through.
And just to a commercial break, there are a bunch of books and movies done about this whole situation. You have one recent movie is called American Made.
Yeah, Tom Cruise.
Tom Cruise, yeah. That's in part of the movie. It's about that whole thing about drugs trafficking for financing the war. There's another movie called Kill the Messenger that was about how a journalist that was writing about this whole conflict. So it's interesting because nowadays it's sort of reviving that part of history.
Talking about movies, there's a great movie I saw on the way down here. It's called What Happened to Monday. But in the mid-90s, there's a breath of fresh air. There's new ownership and new leadership, right? Tell us about that.
So in 1990, democratic elections were held here in Nicaragua, and the communist government lost to a right-wing government, to a right-wing party, who established a right-wing, market-driven economy. And the businesses that were previously run by the state, including the Joya de Nicaragua factory, were privatized back to the hands of different owners, or were sold, or were divested from the state. And that's how originally the factory was handed down. The property of the factory was handed down to the hands of the workers. So a cooperative of 89 workers of the factory was established, and they were handed down the ownership of the company. However, imagine a war-torn country with no access to resources, finance, lack of communication, very difficult to do business. They couldn't make it work. So they started looking for alternative people who would support them. And they went to my father, Dr. Juan Martinez Cuenca, and they asked for his support to find people that could be interested in either investing or acquiring the company.
Now, why did they ask him?
He was, during the 1980s, he was a Minister of Trade. So he was involved in the operations that helped sell the cigars during the embargo era. So he knew the product. He didn't know anything about making cigars, but he loved the cigar and he knew the people. So he started working with them. He started initially working to find investors. He even brought people from Switzerland, from Spain, from Germany, and nobody wanted to invest in a company in a war-torn country like Nicaragua. Not even in a cigar company, tobacco company. So eventually he decided to take a loan from a bank, from a financial institution, and he ultimately acquired the company from the workers, with the commitment, however, that all of those people that were the responsibles of making cigars, they remain here.
Yeah.
Again, he didn't know anything about making cigars. He knew about smoking cigars, but nothing about making cigars. So he needed their support, and they remain until today. Some of them continue to work here, and that was part of the commitment. My father and myself don't come from 5 generations of tobacco growing, so I didn't grow up under the shade of a tobacco plant. I got immersed into the business thanks to my father's hard work and enthusiasm and love for the products and for the people. And since then, 1990s was a great opportunity to reinvent the brand, to bring it back to the US market, to bring it back to Europe and to many other places where the brand was well known before. During that decade of the 1990s, many other companies came to Nicaragua and established themselves here. Companies that you well know, like Oliva, like Perdomo, like Drew Estate. Jonathan came during the mid-1990s to Nicaragua to explore and start building his cigar empire. And Nicaraguan cigars started getting traction. This is sort of the second birth of the Nicaraguan cigar industry.
And the boom started. The boom was in the late 90s.
The boom actually began mid-1990s and ended in 1998 approximately. And the boom was basically a moment in which there was a huge demand for premium cigars, wherever they came from, the DR, Mexico, or the Honduran, especially Nicaraguans. So this is where most of the well-known brands were established. Rock Patel was established during that. Most of the brands that you find nowadays in the U.S. humidor were developed or started during that time. We went from having one single factory in 1992, which was this one, to having more than 60 companies establish themselves by 1996.
Wow.
By 1998, unfortunately, most of them have closed down. So by 1998, we had 20 surviving factories. Some of them, you no longer see them. Some of them remain. Those who made smart decisions and smart investment in creating good brands survive. And some of them flourished, even in the midst of adversity.
And that's when the birth, pretty much, of your staple, your number one brand was created, was in the early 2000s, right?
Correct. In 1998, when all this happened, natural catastrophes, the boom ended, we were stuck, the company was stuck with a warehouse full of cigars. It was one blend in 13 different sizes, but it was just one blend. So in that process of trying to pick up yourself, clean up the dust, you start thinking, and they started, brainstorming, how can we recover this? How can we recover a leading position in the marketplace? That's how the team, led by my father, started developing alternative blends that would differentiate from the original blend, and that would cater to cigar lovers in a different way. And they started experimenting with the core, with the essence of Nicaraguan tobacco, which in the origin was strength. Nicaraguan tobacco, and as we said at the very beginning, Nicaraguan tobacco is known for its strength.
Yes.
So they started experimenting, working. They took one farm, one tobacco leaf from one farm, and they made Antaño 1970, which back then was probably the strongest cigar in the marketplace.
So Joya de Nicaragua started a new segment in this industry, the full body cigar.